Hollow Knight is a great game. That's not exactly a startling revelation, but it's one I only had relatively recently. In the last few years, I've sworn to not purchase any new games until I've at least tried all of the games I already own. I've been good about sticking to this, for the most part, and I've managed to get the number of games I haven't played on my Steam library down to about 10, which is quite impressive considering there was a fairly large list of games that had just been sitting there untouched, and one of these titles was Hollow Knight. I can't even remember where I got it from exactly. I think I got it as a Christmas present one year or something, but I didn't play it until the December of 2022. But when I did play it, yeah, it was fucking amazing. I've poured quite a lot of hours into it since, and it quickly became one of my favorite games of all time. However, as fantastic as it is, there are a few niggling issues I have with it, which is what this video is about. Look, I just want to talk about Hollow Knight, but pretty much everything that makes it so incredibly good has already been said. There's really not much else I can add to that discussion. So instead I'm going to do what I did with my Wind Waker review, and just focus on the handful of faults the game has just because I feel like playing devil's advocate. Hollow Knight is a 9 out of 10 game in my opinion, but here's why it doesn't quite reach a 10 out of 10 for me. First problem, it's too stingy with benches. The funny thing is that I had rather mixed feelings about Hollow Knight during my first playthrough. I like to be fairly cautious and methodical about how I play Metroidvania games, but because of how vague the maps can be and how far apart the benches often are, I wasn't able to play it how I wanted to, which was rather annoying. It wasn't until my second playthrough, once I had gotten a handle on how the game worked, that it really clicked for me. So personally, I think there's some steps the game could have taken to be less daunting for new players and less annoying for veteran players. The maps aren't perfect, but they do their job reasonably well, so I won't complain about them. But the benches, oh boy, that's a problem. It's fine for a game to be hard, it's fine for a game to really push the player and test their skills. What's not fine is for the game to actively waste the player's time. The game has a bad habit of placing benches way too far away from points of interest, which means that every time you die you have to go through a tedious commute to get all the way back to the point where you died before you can try again. But this isn't testing the player's skill, it's just testing their patience. In particular, the bosses have a bad habit of being far away from any benches. Would it really have been such a big deal to just put a bench a little closer to their lair? It doesn't have to be right outside of the lair, just close enough that you don't have to go through a tedious commute every time you want to have another go at the boss. And in general, the benches are just infrequent enough and just spaced out enough to make it a real pain in the ass whenever you die. Of course, I've become familiar enough with the game that dying isn't something that happens to me too often anymore, but still, more benches would have made the game better. Second problem, the charm system is flawed. Look, in general I like the charms, they remind me of the badges in the Paper Mario games, and some of them are really useful. But the problem is that some of them really aren't, and others are just too costly to be worth it. I really don't know what they were thinking. Maybe in a vacuum, if we assume that the player has all of the notch slots and has all of the charms and can choose whatever they like, the way the charms work is balanced. But in practice, that's not at all the case. At the start of the game, you have very few notches and have to find more, and you also start with no charms and have to find them. And some of them are pretty hard to find, and are frequently guarded by hazards and sometimes even boss fights. So the fact that you have to work to obtain these charms should be enough. Making them cost so many notches on top of that is just excessive, and in many cases renders them not worth using. So in my opinion, all of the charms that cost 4 notches should only cost 3 notches, most of the charms that cost 3 notches should only cost 2, and some of the charms that cost 2 should only cost 1. And as for the Wayward Compass, that thing shouldn't be a charm at all. That should just have been a map upgrade you can purchase like the Quill. I mean, come on, withholding a basic feature like being able to tell where you are on the map unless you give up one of your charm notches is just asinine. And anyone who disagrees is just wrong. Dead wrong. Third problem, bullshit challenges. Despite my issues with the bench placement in this game, most of the challenges in Hollow Knight are tough but fair. One thing that I really admire about Hollow Nest is that it finds an almost perfect balance between providing a challenge but also feeling like a real place. There's some areas where the challenge is toned down in favor of just letting the player drink in the atmosphere, and even in the places where the challenge ramps up, it still fits the overall tone and vibe the game is going for. It's good. But there is one rather glaring exception, and that's the White Palace. God, do I hate this place. This doesn't feel like a real place. This feels like the developers got bored and started ripping off Super Meat Boy. With most of the challenges in Hollow Knight, I felt genuinely proud and triumphant when I managed to beat them. But with the White Palace, I never feel any sense of accomplishment at the end, I'm just thankful it's finally over, which isn't a good sign. I think it's the obnoxious platforming challenges. In most of the other areas, it's a mix of platforming challenges, environmental hazards, and enemies. But here, it's just buzzsaws and spikes over and over. I don't know what the exact solution is, but the simplest solution would be to just make it shorter, so that way it doesn't overstay its welcome. Another bullshit challenge is the flower quest. Now, the flower quest isn't too hard if you know where you need to take the flower, and if you know some tricks that will make the process easier. But those are some pretty big ifs, and your average player is absolutely not going to figure them out on their own without looking it up. And even when you do know what to do, it's still long and tedious. And after going to all that trouble, the reward is just a mask shard. So personally, I think it would have been better if they changed it so that you can use the stag stations. Between the fact that taking any damage destroys the flower, and the fact that figuring out where you need to take the flower is quite tricky as it is, not allowing you to use the stag stations is just excessive. This is another challenge that doesn't really test the player's skill, it just wastes their time. And it should have been modified to be less annoying. Or if they were going to insist on keeping it the same, at the very least make the reward something better than just a mask shard. And finally, while we're on the topic of bullshit challenges, fuck Nightmare Grim. The first boss fight against Grim is tough but fair, and I have no complaints. But Nightmare Grim is actively taking the piss. His attacks do 2 damage each, he moves so fast that you have effectively no chances to heal, and you have to have lightning fast reflexes if you want to try to dodge his attacks, and even then it often comes down to luck. This boss fight is insane and unfair, and only straight up masochists would put themselves through this shit. And while we're discussing Grim, that leads me to the most subjective problem I have with Hollow Knight. Fourth problem. Hit or miss DLC. Team Cherry released all of the DLC for Hollow Knight for free, so it's automatically included for everybody. In some ways I admire them for being so generous, but personally I really wish they hadn't done this. My favorite indie game of all time is The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. So when the first DLC, Afterbirth, came out, I was naturally curious. But while it did have some good new additions, it also made a lot of changes to the game that I didn't really like. And I found that I preferred the base form of the game. Fortunately, it's quite easy to do that. All I have to do is unselect the Afterbirth DLC, and boom, it goes back to The Binding of Isaac Rebirth vanilla. The problem with Hollow Knight is that there really isn't a way to do this, since all of the DLC was bundled together and released to everybody for free, so there's no way to get rid of the content you don't like. In particular, the Grim Troop and Godmaster stuff I found I didn't really care for. In the case of the Grim Troop, it felt very gimmicky and out of place. Hollow Knight is about the fall of Hallownest and the knight's journey to reach the Hollow Knight and end things, one way or another. It's a somber and serious story, and each area you explore and character you meet adds to the atmosphere and overall narrative. But the Grim Troop just feels detached from all that. And the fact that you have to go to different areas of Hallownest to fight and defeat these torch guys feels like a fetch quest. It makes things feel less like a living, breathing world and more like, well, a video game. It's distracting. Of course, some might counter that I could always just not activate the torches and not summon the troop. Problem solved. The problem with that, however, is that then there's no way to get the unbreakable charms, since the bug that does that for you is part of the troop. Personally, I think she should have just been hidden somewhere else, and the Grim Troop should have been part of a paid DLC that you could opt in or out of. Also, the amount of Geo she asks for should have been cut in half, because holy sh*. It's the same thing with the Godmaster content. It's a cute idea, and the boss rushes, or pantheons as the game calls them, can be entertaining, even if they do cross the line into obnoxious sometimes. But I think it was a mistake to include it in the game itself instead of it just being an optional side thing you could access from the main menu. The Radiance was originally the final boss, and it was the source of all the trouble in Hallownest. To suddenly change things so that there's another, even more powerful entity that can actually pull the Radiance into its dreams, and then be defeated that way, just kind of cheapens things if you ask me. So again, I think that either the Godmaster content shouldn't have been in the main game at all, as it feels out of place with the lore and world of Hallownest, or it should have been a paid DLC that people could opt in or out of. Lord knows Team Cherry deserves a little extra money for all the hard work they put in. And now we come to the fifth and by far biggest problem with the game. There's no way to save Myla. This one was a little bit traumatizing for me, because during my first playthrough I would periodically check in on different areas to see if my new abilities could unlock new paths, and so I encountered Myla quite a few times, and each time her cheerful singing would be pleasant and uplifting to hear, but after a few visits she stopped singing and just looked depressed, which was a little disconcerting. And then suddenly, one time when I went to visit her she just started attacking me, and without thinking I killed her. It was upsetting. You can save Sly, you can save Bretta, you can even save Zote, but you can't save Myla, which is downright criminal. So yeah, in order for Hollow Knight to become a 10 out of 10 game for me, we need justice for Myla. And also all of that other stuff I mentioned should probably be addressed. In all seriousness, while Hollow Knight isn't quite perfect, the stuff it does right more than makes up for its tiny handful of faults, and playing it is a genuine joy that at least partly fills the void in my soul. So if you haven't played Hollow Knight, get on it. Despite my complaints in this video, it is definitely worth it. Oh, as for Silk Song, honestly I'm fine with Team Cherry taking as long as they want. Hey, it could be worse.